referenced how proud we both were to escort Senator Warnock up for his oath of office today, but now I will say that's definitely the case. It is truly an honor to be asked to do that, and I'm proud that we did that together. Your speech on behalf of your friend, a great public servant, Marcy Kaptur, just inspired me to stand up and give a speech about a great Virginia woman who passed right before we went into recess, my mother-in-law, Virginia Rogers Holton, who passed away in December. We are gathering the entire family in Kilmarnock, Virginia this Saturday for her funeral at Grace Episcopal Church. And I want to just talk about my mother-in-law because she was an amazing woman and an amazing public servant. Jinx Holton, she was called Jinx because her name Virginia was too complicated for her sister Anne to pronounce. And so from her earliest days, she was Jinx Holton, was born in Roanoke in 1925. In World War I, she graduated from high school at 16 years of age, and it was a little bit rare at the time from Roanoke to go to Wellesley. But she did, starting in the class of 1941. My mother-in-law, Virginia Jinx, had such an Appalachian accent that at Wellesley they insisted that she take elocution lessons to be able to succeed in this sort of Ivy League quality school. Well, the joke was on Wellesley because my mother-in-law took elocution lessons but then became a language major, and by the time she graduated in 1945 was fluent in French, was fluent in German, could speak Spanish, Italian, and a little bit of Russian. And so what does a talented woman with a degree in languages do at that point? She decided to serve her country. She went to New York and went to an institute where she learned to take shorthand in multiple languages, and then she got a job offer from the CIG, the Central Intelligence Group, the precursor to the CIA, and was assigned to work at the U.S. Embassy in Belgium. It was right after the war. Belgium and other nations in Europe were still devastated. It was hard to find an apartment that had a coal heater that you could get coal on occasion to heat because ration cards were still being used. But for 2 years in Europe and then 3 years here in Washington, this young lady from Roanoke, Virginia, served her country. We had heard in my family these stories, but vaguely, because Jinx was of an age where you didn't talk about the fact that you had worked for an intelligence agency, even if it was 60 or 70 years ago. But upon her death, right before Christmas, we found letters squirreled away in the attic, and we spent much of the Christmas holidays reading letters that she wrote to her parents in the 1940s from Brussels, coded, yes, and a little bit diplomatic, but talking about the work that she was doing for her country. Some who know the history of the CIA know that in that period, in the Cold War, the U.S. had all kinds of agents around Europe. What Jinx's job was in Brussels was to take reports from them and then help cable those back to the United States. When she came back to the United States, she worked at the CIA for a very famous founder of the agency, a guy named James Jesus Angleton. Angleton was one of the founders of the CIA and became kind of famous, really infamous, because he was in charge of counter-espionage, figuring out were there people within the CIA who were actually Soviet agents, who were informing on the United States. They played a critical role early in figuring out, for example, that MI6 agents, including Kim Philby, were spying for the Soviet Union while they were working with MI6 in Washington. These were the stories of the time my mother-in-law was there. That was just the first chapter of my mother-in-law's public service. And I was inspired, Mr. President, as you talked about Marcy, because my mother-in-law never held office, but she was a public servant. A year ago, almost exactly, I took to the floor to offer a tribute to my father-in-law, who was a pivotal and history-making governor of Virginia, who was most known for integrating Virginia public schools when they had been segregated for so long. I can assure you that was a joint project. That was not just my father-in-law, Linwood Holton. That was he and his wife, Jinx. They got married in Roanoke in the mid-1950s, and they embarked upon a joint project, which was to make Virginia a competitive two-party state. The Democrats ran everything in Virginia, and it was a very different Democratic Party, Dixiecrats, who believed very much in white supremacy and segregation. But together with his wife, Jinx, my mother-in-law, they decided to help build a two-party democracy in Virginia. and they hoped that the Republican Party would be the racially progressive antidote, opposite, contrary to the segregationist Democrats. She supported Linwood when he ran for the House of Delegates in Roanoke and lost in the 1950s. He came close. He ran 2 years later and was on the verge of victory when Eisenhower sent National Guard troops in to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, and Republican fortunes tanked in the South that year. He lost again. He was the Republican Party nominee for governor in 1965, and Jinx was one of his best campaign assets. He lost that race, but the fact that a Republican could even get 35% was seen as amazing and revolutionary. How could that happen? And then they came back, and he ran again in 1969, and he became the first Republican to be popularly elected governor in over 100 years, with Jinx by his side campaigning all the time. They faced a very critical decision within months of taking office. The inauguration was in January of 1970. In the spring of 1970, a federal district court judge, Robert Marriage, ordered that the school systems in Richmond be integrated. Now, of course, this was 16 years after Brown versus Board of Education, but Virginia had used one delay tactic and one stunt after the next to keep schools from truly being integrated. But now there was a district court judge who were ordering that it happened. The political pressure on the Holton family was, you're the governor, you need to keep doing what all Virginia governors have done, and you need to fight against integration. Instead, Lynn and Jinx got their 4 children together, including my wife Ann, who was a middle schooler, the second of their 4 children. And they said, we have a family decision to make. The tradition that we think is a bad one is that the powers that be fight against the notion that children can sit in a classroom if their skin colors are different. And that's what we are being urged to do. But we as a family think that all people and all Virginians are equal, and they shouldn't be discriminated in the classrooms of this Commonwealth. And so our decision in an official capacity will be not to oppose busing, not to fight it, but we want to go further than that. We don't want to just make a legal argument. You are living in the city of Richmond. The city of Richmond has very segregated schools. The governor's mansion is not in any school zone. You could go to whatever school you want. But we think you should go to the neighborhood schools that are predominantly African-American schools. And if you do that, we can send the loudest message possible that education is a value that's important, and kids should be able to learn together regardless of the color of their skin. When school opened in the fall of 1970, my father-in-law Linwood took my wife's older sister Taylo to a high school, Kennedy High School in Richmond, and that picture made the front page of the New York Times. The New York Times had carried many a picture of Southern governors standing in schoolhouse doors blocking African-American kids from coming in, but they only had one picture of a white Southern governor escorting his own child into a school that was a predominantly African-American school. The Richmond paper carried a very similar picture. It was not of Linwood and Taylo, but it was of my mother-in-law Jinx and my wife Ann. Jinx escorting Ann and her brother into the middle school, Mosby Middle School, a nearly completely African-American middle school named after a Confederate general, General Mosby, Colonel Mosby. But the Richmond paper carried that similar photo. A family deciding that they wanted to stand for integration and civil rights, and not just in words, but in deeds that would be viewed by all and understood by all as a message. Linwood is the governor, and people talk about Linwood, but it's impossible to look at a decision like that and not recognize, as is the case for so many of us, that what we do, we only do with the support and the encouragement of our families, of our spouses, of our kids. And in that family decision made by Linwood Holton and his wife Jinx, the Holton administration did the thing that it was most known for, which was turn Virginia from a backward-facing Confederate museum piece into a forward-facing, more dynamic Commonwealth. Commonwealth, the wealth we hold in common. We are a community. My wife Ann, in a kind of an unpredictable storybook tale, went on to become First Lady of Virginia when I was elected governor in 2005. She's the only person who's ever lived in the Virginia governor's mansion as a child and then as an adult. And that means that Jinx Holton is the only First Lady of Virginia that's ever had a child who also became First Lady. And during the 4 years I was governor, Virginia has a single 4-year term, we had so many wonderful memories where we had my mother and father-in-law, 36 years after they had been governor and First Lady, staying with us and wrestling with the problems of the day just as they did. And one of my proudest memories of my father-in-law and mother-in-law came during the fall of 2006. My legislature, over my objection, had placed on the ballot a constitutional amendment to ban any recognition of same-sex couples. Not just marriage, civil union, any recognition of same-sex couples. And my legislature could put that on the ballot even though I objected. I campaigned against it. I campaigned very hard to convince Virginians that they should not place in their Constitution a limitation on civil rights. Instead, we should be placing in the Constitution a protection of civil rights. But I'll always remember the phone call I made to my father and mother-in-law when I said that my wife and I were going to stand on the steps of the governor's mansion and come out forcefully against the amendment. And I asked Lynn and Jinx, how would you guys feel as a great civil rights family to join us? Now, they are of a different era. Linwood, born in 1923 in Big Stone Gap, Virginia, and Jinx, born in 1925 in Roanoke, Virginia, but they didn't hesitate for a minute. They remembered being in the governor's mansion and making a stand as a couple for civil rights, and they said, we'll be there tomorrow to join you. And we stood on the steps of the Capitol in 2006, and at that point, Ann and I had been married 22 years, and they had been married about 52 years. And we said, we're standing here, we got 74 years of marriage, and we're going to tell you that there's nothing in this that harms our marriage in any way, and marriage is the most wonderful institution, and all should have the right to marry whom they choose, and that's why this amendment should be defeated. I can think of many other instances where I was so proud of my mother-in-law, but that was definitely one of the most memorable. We were with my mother-in-law on Thanksgiving. We go down and spend time in the little community, Kilmarnock, where she lived in a retirement community. The first thing we do on Thanksgiving every time we visit is we run in the 2-mile turkey trot, Irvington Turkey Trot, that's a fundraiser for a local charity. And it was many different cousins and grandchildren and my wife and I. And we were going to do that and then go over and be with my mother-in-law and have lunch with her. But we heard when we were there that, no, she wants to come out and watch. Well, it was about 30 degrees. We figured, well, you know, your health isn't that great. That's not such a good thing. But my mother-in-law got all bundled up, came out in her walker, watched us run the race. We had a wonderful Thanksgiving together. And then she declined rapidly but peacefully and not in pain in the 3 weeks after Thanksgiving. And she died 3 weeks after Thanksgiving Day. But again, hearing my colleague and friend, Sherrod Brown, talk about Representative Capter and the unique role that she has played as a congresswoman in doing wonderful things for her constituents, but also setting an example of women in leadership, I thought, you know what? I gave a speech about my father-in-law and his historic governorship a year ago. Nothing that he did in politics or in life would have been possible without the wonderful partnership that he forged. And my mother-in-law, Jinx, from her Central Intelligence Group, CIA days, all the way to becoming a path-breaking First Lady and then a board member of every charitable known to man in Roanoke, Richmond, Fairfax, or Kilmarnock, where she lived for the last 20 years of her life. She was a public servant from day one until her death. And I am so happy to have a chance just to put on the record a tribute to a great mother-in-law and a wonderful public servant. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.